Students. I've been assigned the task of talking to you about consent. This is my email ID. If you think that you need to ask me something more after the program or something else, you can always email me. So consent is actually based on the basic principle of primum non nocere, which means that do no harm. Our primary job is to benefit, but at no cost we should be causing any harm to the patient. And it is basically, it was started for new medical products like drugs or devices, because when you introduce a new drug, you don't know whether it is going to benefit or harm. And there's a lot of ethical issue involved in it, especially when you are doing research on something new, because you have to find out whether it is, number one, safe enough, and number two, whether the benefits are much more than the risks which would be caused to the patient. And the last is that it has a positive aspect, that the aim is to protect the rights and welfare of the human subjects, that is our patients. When a patient comes to the hospital, something is implied or implicit. Like when you go to a restaurant and order food, it is understood that when the bill comes, you will pay for it. You can't say, no, no, you didn't ask me to sign a contract beforehand that if I order a food and consume it, I will have to pay. So this is what is known as implicit, implied, or assumed consent, that if a person comes to a hospital, he or she has agreed for certain things. For example, to give a history to the doctor, to answer the questions which are asked, blood tests, simple x-rays. We don't take any consent because it is presumed that if the patient has come to the hospital, these things would be done. For certain other things, especially an internal examination in a female or even a male patient, upper rectal examination requires an expressed verbal consent. You don't presume that because the patient has come to you with abdominal pain, he would allow you to do upper rectal examination. You have to ask, but it is only asked verbally. It is not written, it is not documented. On the other hand, for anything more major, you need a written consent, which then becomes a document. And especially for procedures which involve risks, it has to be what is known as an informed written consent, because the patient may not know. He or she is a lay person. He doesn't know what is the risk involved, how much is the risk involved, and how does it weigh against the expected benefits. So it is you or us who have to inform the patient about all these things. And then the consent can be generic or it could be specific. And this applies mainly to biomaterials, where if you take a sample of a patient, then whether it will be used for any future research, but more and more ethics committees are now saying that you specify as to what research will be done on that biomaterial. And in the clinical practice, like in our files, which probably is not appropriate, there is a generic consent which is taken at the time of admission for all procedures, but that probably doesn't hold. For every procedure, you need to have a separate and special consent. So what are the components of consent? One is the information which we provide to the patient, and second is the consent which the patient gives to us. So that is why it is called informed written consent. And then it must mention as to what is the diagnosis, what the patient is suffering from, as much as we know at that stage. What is the proposed plan of management? And if it is a procedure, what procedure and what will be done? Then it should talk of the expected benefits and the anticipated risks, including discomforts like tubes, drains, immobility, recovery, back to work, and all those things. and not only just mention, but estimated probability, likelihood of the expected benefits and anticipated risks. If we know, we can mention about, we can mention approximately, but some quantification of these benefits and risks need to be done. So to give you an example, when we do a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which is removal of the gallbladder by putting in these telescopes, we always tell the patient that, look, there is about 5% chance that we may not be able to do it laparoscopically, and then we will have to do an open operation by making an incision in your tummy. Similarly, when we do a major procedure like pancreatoduodenectomy, removal of the pancreas and duodenum for a cancer of the pancreas, we tell them that, look, there is a possibility or there is a risk about 5% in general, which would vary from patient to patient, that there may be a mortality after the procedure. You also need to mention alternatives. So if I'm advising operation, I need to tell the patient whether there is an alternative of treatment by chemotherapy or radiotherapy, like in esophageal cancer. If I'm advising surgery, I have to tell them whether there is a possibility or an alternative that endoscopically the stone can be removed from the common bile duct. And also, if there is an alternative, why is it that I am advising surgery and not the alternative? And then, as we said earlier, this is a written consent, so it has to be documented on a piece of paper. It has to have signatures, both yours as well as the patient, and a witness, which is a third party, and it has to be dated because each consent has a validity. It is not that you take the consent today and it remains valid throughout the life of the patient or throughout the follow-up of the patient. You have to take a consent each and every time for each and every different procedure. So what information? Information has to be adequate, complete, comprehensive, and correct. So obviously you can't read out the whole chapter of the book to the patient, but as much as is required for him or her to understand what is going to be done and what are the benefits and risks, that much you have to tell. So that is usually left to the judgment of the doctor who's taking the consent. And therefore, you ought to know how to summarize that chapter which you read in your textbook in a few lines or in a few words to a lay person. And that also is a skill, that also is an art which gradually you have to learn. The language in which you tell this to the patient has to be what the patient understands, not what you have learned in your classroom or from your textbook. And obviously, you have to use non-technical terms as far as possible. And it has to be tailored to the educational level of the patient. So when you are talking to a farmer who is not educated versus when you are talking to a business professional who is highly educated, may even be more educated and more intelligent than you, your language will be different. You have to be patient. It should not be done in a hurry. And ideally, it should not be a monologue. It should not be that you are talking and the patient is listening. You should pause in between and give an opportunity to the patient to ask, to clarify. And therefore, it should be a bilateral exchange of information. And this is what I was saying. Now, obviously, there is a lot of information there, but I'm sure none of you or me can understand this. And it has to be in a language which the patient understands. Now, most of our documents or almost all our documents are in English, but a ideal informed written consent form, especially for a research project, those of you who've participated in a drug trial would know this, that they all insist, and for the state of UP, it is Hindi, English, and Urdu. So all consent forms are translated and then translated back into the original language to make sure that the translation is correct. And all these options have to be made available. So consent is not just a piece of paper. It is a procedure. It is a process in which both we as well as the patient and his relatives participate. So another example, if there is a patient who has this cancer in the rectum, and I tell the patient you have rectal cancer, you will undergo an abdominoperineal resection or an APR. This means a permanent stoma. You may have some urinary incontinence and you would later require adjuvant therapy. Now, this is correct. There's nothing wrong in this information. But how many of our patients who usually come from lower or middle income group, hardly any patient in our hospital is from upper or upper middle class, very few. So how many of them who are not very well educated, and as I am fond of saying, even educated people in India are medically illiterate, how many of them will understand this? So you have to change the language. If I were to take the consent of such a patient who's not very well educated, who's not very familiar with medical or technical terms, I would say, you have cancer in your stool passage. टट्टी के रास्ते में आपको कैंसर है. You will undergo a major operation which will remove your stool passage and it will make a permanent opening. तो आपका टट्टी का रास्ता अलग से एक नया रास्ता बनाया जाएगा आपके पेट में, and post operatively आपको पेशाब करने में कुछ दिक्कत हो सकती है. And now most people understand what is chemotherapy. Radiotherapy may or may not, but you say bijli ka ilaj, they understand. So you have to tailor your language, the terminology, depending on what you expect the patient to understand. There is a word called mansplaining, and hopefully this is becoming less and less now, but it still happens in most societies, that when a man talks to a woman as if you are on a higher pedestal and the lady is on a lower pedestal. So same word has been kind of changed by this in this publication to doxplaining. When we talk to the patients, we do in a patronizing way, as if, agreed, we know much more, but when we are talking for taking a consent, we have to give up this attitude and we have to make it sure that we are at the same level. And these are few terms which we have to understand. Most of us still do it. I cannot say that I don't do it. I also do it. But as far as possible, they should not be done. This is what the standard teaching is. I'll explain it to you a little later, how to modify it in our own setting. Patronizing means that you are kind and friendly, but you have a sense of superiority. So you are trying to convey a feeling that I know more than you and what I say is correct and this is good for you. Condescending is little derogatory. It makes the other person feel inferior, smaller, and you speak with a kind of dictatorial कि ये करा लो नहीं तो कुछ नहीं होगा तुम्हारा. And I must say that I've heard this our colleagues telling the patient in this tone. And paternalistic is a little better, that you are acting in their interest, but you are restricting their freedom to decide for themselves. Now, why I said that this is mentioned in the standard books, because all these terms come from the West. In our setup, where majority of our patients probably will not understand, even if we try to explain to them in non-technical terms, and they are not in a kind of position, either because of their educational status or because of their stress and anxiety because of the current illness, to take a wise decision. Sometimes we have to be paternalistic, that we take an attitude as if we are deciding for them in their own interest. Or sometimes we even become patronizing, but I would say we should not become condescending. We should not make them feel small. So I do it several times. When the patient is not able to decide, I tell them that, look, depending on the age of the patient, if it were my son or my mother or my sister, this is what I think I will do. So that way I am reassuring them that whatever I am doing it in their interest. Theoretically speaking, ideally speaking, that is wrong. But in our socio-economic status, probably, this is my personal opinion, probably many a time we have to do it. And then the best principle to follow it is, what would you do if the patient were your son, your daughter, your sister, your mother, your aunt, your uncle? Whatever you would do for them probably will be the best. So the consent, now the patient's part, patient should be well informed, which means that you have told the patient everything which he or she should know in order to take this decision. So they should know, but at the same time, they should comprehend and understand, which means that it has to be tailored to that level. And they should have sufficient time to ask questions, to discuss with their family, friends, so that they have a clear mind. And then after all this, they take a considered, voluntary, willingly decision. Autonomy means that they take the decision, they are not influenced by others. But as I said earlier, in our setup, autonomy probably is not that possible to that extent. There is always pressure, either from, I wouldn't say pressure, but there is always advice from us, there is advice from family, friends, and of course there are financial issues involved. And the patient should be intelligent enough to take a reasoned and well considered decision, because if the patient is not intelligent enough, he or she unknowingly, inadvertently may take a wrong decision. And that is why the ideal requisitions or requisites of consent may not be possible in all our patients. Of course, it has to be voluntary. That means there is no undue persuasion or influence कि देखो ये करा लो, अगर अभी कर लोगे तो हम जल्दी कर देंगे, नहीं तो फिर आपको 6 महीने वेट करना पड़ेगा. No, that should not be there. Or it should not be some kind of enticement, especially in research, that you give undue compensation. Reasonable compensation is allowed, but undue compensation कि देखो अगर आप इस ट्रायल में पार्टिसिपेट करोगे तो आपको 10,000 रुपए मिलेंगे, that is not correct. But yes, if it involves extra visit to the hospital, if it involves hospitalization which otherwise would not be done, if it involves an expensive investigation which otherwise would not be done, that should be compensated. There should be no pressure कि जो भी फैसला करना है अभी कर लो, एक हफ्ते बाद नहीं आपको टाइम मिलेगा. And it should not be that there is any punishment if the patient refuses, that if you don't decide for surgery, then you can't be treated in this hospital. No, that cannot be done. And as I said, compulsion should not be there. But in our setup, financial constraints do play an important role. Definitely, if there are two options, patients usually would go for a cheaper option, for a less expensive option, especially if they are not financially well off. And as is in most of the cases, they are paying for their own treatment from their own pocket. So ideal process of consenting may not be possible in each and every case. Third component is the documentation, that after the process, after the procedure has been done, it has to be documented on a piece of paper, and that should be complete. So patient's details, name, age, sex, the ID number as far as the hospital is concerned, the diagnosis, the exact name of the procedure should be correctly documented. Who's going to operate or who's going to do the procedure, signatures of both, date, and ideally a copy of this should be given to the patient. And this is a statutory requirement when you do these the sponsored drug trials where there is a monitoring agency. Then they insist that you make two copies, one goes to the records and one is given to the patient. There are some special situations where there are some directives, but these directives again come from the West. They may not be literally translatable to our setup, like children who are minors, but there is a legal age in the US that although there is a minor, but there is a legal age. Then you need parents' permission and both parents' permission, but even after that, you need the acceptance of the child for doing the procedure. There are some children which are in this group, emancipated children. There are some vulnerable groups. And in case of pregnant women, especially for pregnancy related procedures, you need the permission or the consent of both wife and husband. There are some situations where, yes, you have a right to waive the consent because it is not possible. As far as possible, you try to get it, but if it is not there, so if it is a life-saving situation, or if serious or irreversible harm like amputation, requirement of amputation and all, risk of severe systemic sepsis, bleeding which has to be controlled immediately. There are situations where you can do a procedure if consent is not available. But in such cases, it is always better that you have a group, you have a team. Don't do it all alone. Get your anesthetist involved, get your critical care person involved, get your physician colleague involved, get your medical colleague involved, and have a group which says and documents that because it is a life-saving situation, it is an emergency situation, and no person is available to give a consent, patient is not in a position to give consent, we are going ahead with this procedure in the interest of the patient. Because unfortunately, if there is a mishap, a mortality, then this will come to save you in case the relatives come back and say, why did you do this procedure? Because they wouldn't understand that you did it in good intent to save the life or the limb of the patient. And then if the person is not competent, then you take a surrogate consent. Obviously, a patient who is on ventilator, you want to do a procedure, you can't take the consent of the patient. So in that case, you take consent of the relatives. And now this concept of living wills, and now I understand that even in India, living will has become legal, that I can declare that in case I am in a state where the chances of survival are low, and the quality of life is going to be poor, I may not be given any treatment, and we need to respect them. So in that case, to discontinue the treatment, you need consent of the relatives, but there is a long legal process involved in that. I don't think I know that, and I can go into details of that. So just to give you some examples, these are real life examples from our own hospital, unfortunately from my own ward, where there are gross inadequacies in the documentation. In the document on the left, only the name of the patient is mentioned, and there is no signature of the patient, although there is a signature of the witness or the guardian, but it has no meaning because this is an adult patient. There should have been a signature of the patient. In the document on the right, there is no ID. Patient's name, age, gender, ID number, nothing is mentioned. The doctor has not signed. Even in the first document, the doctor has not signed. And so these are incomplete documents which will not be acceptable at all in the consumer protection forum or in a court of law. And these are some examples from the media that when there was incomplete consent, it was taken as negligence. There was no negligence in treatment, but the consent process was incomplete, and the Consumer Protection Forum held the doctor and the hospital responsible for negligence. And this is a very new that the consumer panel has ruled that a blanket consent form which you apply to any and every procedure is not correct. It amounts to what is known as an unfair trade practice. Unfortunately, medicine also has been clubbed with trades, and they say that for each procedure you must have a separate, specific to that procedure, specific probably to that patient, detailed consent form. So unfortunately, our profession has changed. It has become more a business. Patient has become a consumer. We have become a provider. Earlier, we used to heal, and now we treat. There is a subtle difference between that. And same way, care has become management. And we also look at organs and diseases rather than the person as a whole. And what used to be based on trust is now has been replaced by an agreement. But that is the fact of the matter, and therefore we have to be careful about this process of agreement. So basically, consent is a moral responsibility. I still consider that is the most important reason why there should be a consent. But moral responsibility can be covered by a verbal consent also. It is an ethical obligation of our profession, but now it has become a legal compulsion, and that is why it has to be documented, it has to be written. And as far as our profession is concerned, it is the central tenet of both clinical research, where patients are involved, where we test a new drug or a device on them, and definitely in patient care. Because as we all know, in medicine, for any situation, there is no one absolutely correct or right treatment. There are always options. There are always outcomes which you cannot predict, and therefore information and consenting is very, very important. So the basic principle is that the right, the safety, and the well-being of the subject, that means the patient, is above and should prevail over the larger interest of the science or society. Because when we are dealing with the patient, our agreement, our contract, or our kind of obligation is to that patient at that point of time. Of course, as a scientist, our obligation, our responsibility is towards science or society, but for an individual patient, it is him or her. There are many problems also with the consent process, which come in, like there could be misunderstanding. If we don't explain well, patient may not understand these terms. Uh, some patients, they get scared of the adverse events if we give too much information, and they refuse treatment, which is a bad decision on their part. But then who decides what is good and bad? Because we, on one hand, we say autonomy, on the other hand, we say, no, no, your decision is not correct. So there are problems. And to the extent that in some countries like UK and US, I know for US for certain, because my son lives there, that vaccination for children is parents' choice. It is not compulsory as it is in India. The parents decide whether to get the vaccine for their child or not, and that some of the doctors feel is not correct. So there are problems with too much of information and too much of autonomy being given to the patients for the consent process also. So I would like to kind of summarize or end up by saying that yes, you should perform, you should do what your duty is, but at the same time, keep informing the patient or the relatives, keep documenting, and whatever you document, preserve it, because that is what will save you. So what you do in terms of hard work, night duties, frequent looking after of the patient, spending hours in the theater or wherever, it helps and saves the patient. What you communicate while doing all this to the patient and to the relatives, keep informing them about the patient's status, avoids the litigation even if things go wrong. I don't think any of our patients who even died in our hands has went to the court, because we kept communicating with them even if the patient was not well. But if there is a litigation, unfortunately, what will save you is only what you document. Then you can't say, no, no, I spent the whole night with the patient and still the patient deteriorated, if it is not documented in the file that every half an hour or every 1 hour you looked at the patient, you recorded the vitals, you took some decisions, you talked to your consultant. So what saves you ultimately if there is a litigation is the document, and you must document everything. You must document the facts, you must document the thought process also. You must document the discussion which you held with your colleague in cardiology or nephrology, and what you decided, what was planned, what was done. Everything must be documented, and that alone will save you if there is unfortunately a litigation. So do, but at the same time, document also. So I would like to end up with that. And this picture is because this is a book primarily for surgery students, but there are a few chapters which may be of help to the students who are in clinical disciplines, MD, DM, and MCH students in clinical disciplines, as to how to present a case in the exam, how to answer the questions, how to behave in the exam. So those of you who want those preliminary pages, as a complimentary soft copy, please send me a mail, vkkapoor.india@gmail.com. I'll be happy to send you those